It's very hard to think about the law without thinking about the interpretation. Lawyers, judges, society at large always asks, okay, we have this legal rule, but should we interpret it? Interpretation is so basic to the law that we can sometimes lose sight of what's the point of it. The reason why law is interpreted is because law is authoritative. When you're making decisions in law, you try to make decisions according to the rules that have been laid down. Therefore, it follows quite logically that you have to put some effort in trying to understand the meaning of those rules. As it happens, those rules will always be expressed in human language, and human language can sometimes be a very opaque medium, and therefore we must put some effort in trying to find the meaning of what linguistically has been stated. Interpretation is so pervasive, so common in our thinking about the law, that often people think that everything about the law is about interpretation. But this is not true. Legal problems can subsist even after things have been correctly interpreted. This should be pretty clear to you already, because in our previous lectures we have discussed conflict of rules. The idea of a conflict of rules is that we have this rule A and this rule B, which say incompatible things. Then, assuming that they have been correctly interpreted, they still say incompatible things. Then interpretation is no longer what will solve the problem. You have to find some priority rules that will allow you to decide which of these rules, A or B, is most important. The idea that interpretation is everything is also part of our culture now, because our modern era has a tendency to confuse language and reality, to think that there is no such thing as reality outside the domain of language. I think this is a confusion, and its falsehood can be very easily shown by example. If I give you the directions to a bakery, but the directions are wrong, no amount of interpretation will allow you to find the correct directions for the bakery. I simply need to provide you with new directions that are correct. In this example, the connection between language and reality is shown in the negative, because that connection is severed by the mistake in giving you the directions of the bakery. We immediately find this slippage between what is being said and what needs to be pointed at in the real world. There are four big methods for interpretation, and we're going to go through them one by one. These are textualism, subjective intent, systematic interpretation, and teleological interpretation. This last one is probably better called counterfactual interpretation for reasons that I will explain later. Naturally, some writers will give different names for some of these methods. Some writers might break them down into 5 methods or maybe even 6 methods, but the content tends to be relatively the same. And then in covering these 4 methods, we will pretty much cover all the field. Textualism is simply a refusal to go beyond the obvious meaning of the text, to stick to the words as they have been written down. Although this is presented in the literature as a method of interpretation, I think philosophically it's better to think about this as an educated refusal to interpret. Instead of trying to find the hidden meaning of words, we just pick the meaning that's right there, the meaning that is immediate, instead of trying to find some other meaning. An example of textualism might be found in the case Preety versus the United Kingdom. This case concerned a terminally ill woman who wanted to be granted euthanasia. According to the European Convention of Human Rights, people have a right to life. The claimant in Preety versus the United Kingdom tried to present this right to life as including also a right to death, that is, as being reversible, as it being a freedom that can be used or rejected as one desires. However, the court took the right to life quite literally and said, well, here it says right to life, in nowhere it extends into a right to euthanasia. So there we have a textual approach to a legal problem. Textualism has an interesting profile of virtues and vices. We must say that textualism tends to be very predictable because the normal meaning of words is visible to everybody. Everybody can understand it without having to do some extensive research. It is also the case that the meaning of words tends to be rather objective, and in most scenarios, most people will come to the same conclusions if they are told to fix their attention on the text as written. Another virtue of textualism is its faithfulness. A judge applying textual methods of interpretation will not stray too far away from what the legislator, what the authority writing down the law has wanted. In the negative, the stubborn desire to stick with the text as written can lead to absurd results. Moreover, textualism tends to be stuck in the past, because laws are not reformed as often as they should, at least in some scenarios. A textualist judge will stick to text that maybe made sense 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but that might not make sense today. Next, we have subjective intent. I think this could just be called intent to simplify things, but I choose to call it subjective intent because that's how the literature may often call it. Subjective intent as a method of interpretation tries to find what the rule maker really wanted. It tries to go to the past and inquire what was in the mind of the legislator. So remember that textualism sticks to the text, but it can often be the case that the text is in one way or another defective in expressing what the person writing down the text really wanted to show. Textualism would say we stick by the text. Subjective intent would say, no, let's go a little bit further back and try to find what the person writing that text would actually wanted. An example of this could be present, let's say, in cases denying same-sex marriage, because they go into the mind of the people writing typical human rights instruments, and they say, well, when the European Convention of Human Rights was written and then signed in the 50s, nobody thought that marriage could be between couples of the same sex. And therefore, if we go to what the legislator wanted back then, we will find that protections of private and family life would not extend to same-sex couples. And we would also find that it would not be discriminatory to understand that marriage is between a man and a woman, because the ideas of the persons that wrote the laws would have accepted that that's the normal way of doing things. In terms of virtues and vices, I actually regard subjective intent as the absolute worst of all the interpretive techniques. To its favor, it is faithful. In a different way than textualism, a judge using subjective intent does not make value judgments, but rather sticks to what the legislator wanted. So in that way, he shows its fidelity towards the authority of the law. But its vices are quite significant. Like textualism, it is stuck in the past. Okay? And that is a problem up to a point. But a bigger problem is that unlike textualism, subjective intent is unpredictable. It can be quite difficult to find what the legislator wanted 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. While textualism is low-tech, and that is a good thing, that is, everybody can open the law and look at the words and then come up with their normal and natural meaning, subjective intent is high-tech. You have to make historical research and try to reconstruct the meaning of words and the ways of thinking of an era that is past. Sometimes this might even prove to be impossible. So in that way, if you think that subjective intent is the way to go, you might have to do a lot of work to actually know what the laws mean or want to mean in terms of historical research. One further problem with subjective intent is that it might not exist in any significant sense. That is to say, we must not forget that legislators are not one person, but a group of persons. If legislators come down to write down a rule, if we try to inquire what they wanted in their hearts and in their minds, we might find that they wanted different things. So instead of it saying, okay, what did the person writing the law want? That might have an answer if you're talking about an individual. But if we are talking about a collective, let's say 100, 200 legislators, there might not be this one thing that they all wanted. They might have wanted different things. And then we cannot say that there is this one subjective intent that we try to find, because there were different intents. The intents of the right-wing party, of the Green Party, of the Labour Party may all have been different. And the only thing that is in common amongst these different legislators might just be the simple text that takes us back to textualism. Systematic interpretation could also be called contextual interpretation. It is a method of interpretation that tries to understand the law in light of other legal commitments. The motto of systematic interpretation could be something like, just take a wider look around. When you understand the meaning of this law, understand it in harmony with the other laws that have also been made in this subject matter or even in other subject matters. Examples of systematic interpretation tend to be quite technical, and therefore they're different to present in this setting. But here we may think, for example, of the defective wording of Article 1 of the UN Convention Against Torture. This article defines torture, which is outlawed under human rights. But the wording is defective, because when it defines torture, it excludes from the definition of torture the pain and suffering arising from lawful sanctions. Interpreted legally, that would come up with the absurd idea that horrible prison conditions would not amount to torture because they are lawful sanctions. What you can do to get out of the interpretive problem of Article 1 of the UNCAT is to understand that the concept of lawfulness is a concept that is connected to other human rights norms. And then prison conditions that are brutal or inhumane would not qualify as lawful, and therefore they would not be exempted under Article 1 of the UNCAT from the definition of torture. So essentially what you're doing here is reading Article 1 of UNCAT in light of other human rights conditions or part of other human rights provisions that state how prison conditions should be. And what about the virtues and vices of systematic interpretation? Well, the virtues is that it is faithful. It also tries to obey what the legislator wanted. Instead of trying to obey the legislator's will in one shot, it tries to obey the legislator's will across the variety of things that the legislator has said. It's also very good that systematic interpretation protects the integrity of the law. By trying to interpret the law as a harmonious system, it ensures that the law is effective and predictable. And then its vices, I would say none. Just as I said that subjective intent is the worst technique of interpretation, I think systematic interpretation is the best. There is no scenario that I can come up with in which using a systematic approach is a bad idea. It may be insufficient to solve your legal problems, but the meaning of legal rules should always be understood contextually in light of all other existing legal commitments. Finally, we have teleological or counterfactual interpretation. This form of interpretation is value-driven. Essentially, it says what meaning of words would be most conducive to furthering certain values such as human dignity, equality, autonomy, or whichever other values one may find to be central to the law. I think teleological interpretation makes a lot of sense being presented as a counterfactual judgment. The question that teleological interpretation asks can be then understood along the lines of what the authorities would have wanted had they known. This can be very easily clarified with an example of the case Obergefell versus Hodge legalizing same-sex marriage in the United States. The line of argumentation of the majority in this case is essentially teleological or counterfactual. The judges deciding in the majority here make a decision by saying, how should we understand the provisions on the US Bill of Rights to further increase the freedom and equality of Americans? And then they come to the conclusion that by making same-sex marriage something that is a legal right, freedom and equality are most advanced. That is the most, let's say, the interpretation that is most favorable to these values. Their judgment is counterfactual. Of course, the founders of the United States did not countenance same-sex marriage as being desirable or possible. But the idea is that had they lived to see what we have seen, had they walked the historical path with us and understood the values of freedom of equality as we have come to understand them, then the founders and the writers of the US Bill of Rights would have wanted to have same-sex marriage as a right. And that is how teleological interpretation proceeds. The virtues and vices of teleological interpretation are pretty much a mirror image of textualism. On the negative side, teleological interpretation is unpredictable and involves significant value judgments. So as opposed to being faithful, as opposed to simply accepting what the authority has laid down, the judge or the lawyer using teleological interpretation says, okay, now I will complete the defective judgment of the authority and try to find what the authority would have wanted had the authority known what we know today. So it involves significant value judgments, and then it can be quite polemical. But on the other hand, it has the virtue of being progressive. Teleological interpretation is not as stuck in the past and can be useful for adapting the law to changing circumstances and to new needs and to new values that may arise in society. So now we can conclude with this overview of these four interpretation techniques. Here you have been presented the definition of the techniques, an example for each, and also I have commented on their virtues and vices. Although I think systematic interpretation is the best of them and subjective intent is the worst of them, I think they all have a role to play. They are all tools in the legal analyst toolbox. To conclude, I also want to mention another possibility. The rulemaker or the legislator is not silent. Interpreting the law is not like interpreting a religious text that comes from an extremely long history where the author of this text is no longer available. The legislator is present as the legislative body, as the democratic people. So interpretation has to be balanced. The possibility of doing interpretation has to be balanced with the possibility of simply asking the legislator to speak again. So instead of trying to find the meaning of this word or the meaning of this rule that is very obscure, something that we can also do in the field of law is simply ask the person who wrote the rule to express his opinion again, now more clearly. The possibility of doing this is essentially encapsulated in techniques of political deference that we cannot cover right now, but essentially are scenarios where judges actually do not make a decision, are silent in a particular decision, in order to give the opportunity of the legislator or the people to speak about the matter.